Ooh, neat.
Hello and welcome to the Mint Condition Comics playthrough video. If you just missed it, we went through the setup where we built the entire comic shop, we've set up all the piles, we determined our hot comic for this round, which will be Malware, and we've determined our round bonus, which for this one will be the Redundant Collector. I've handed out secret powers to each player. I'll give you a peek at mine. So I have Mind Control. It's going to allow me to trade any one comic from my collection for any one comic in the shop. And then my opponent here has X-Ray Vision, which is going to allow them to look at all three piles before deciding which cards to take. Now, we determine order of play with whoever purchased a comic book last. Now, it was me. I will be starting with this player here. A turn consists of 3 steps. The first step you're going to do is trade comics. Now, in order to trade comics, you need to have some in your collection. So at the start of the game, when you take your first turn, neither player will be able to trade anything. So I'll walk through how trade comic works on turn number 2. The second thing you're going to do on a turn is pick piles. You're going to start at the pile furthest away from the main draw pile and go through each one subsequently until you find comics you like and add them to your collection. The third step you'll do will be to manage your collection itself. Any comics that you got that round, you'll simply be putting together, getting into sets, and just shoring up everything in your collection before it's the next player's turn. Now, as I said, I'll start here and I'll begin by picking the piles because I don't have any comics to trade. So, the first pile we're looking at here, we have an issue 1 of Kids with Powers and an issue 2 of Malware. A couple things I want to point out on the comic card issues themselves. Not only will you see the set it's from, as well as the issue number, there's also rarities associated with each. Any card that is rare, only one of them existed in the deck. Now that's prior to setup, before we removed cards or did anything. There's only one, for instance, Kids with Powers issue 1 in the game. Anything that is uncommon or the next highest rarity, there will be 2, and anything common, there will be 3. Also, on issue 1s, you can see that there's a +2 victory points. So some comics themselves will just give you victory points. Another example would be Stellar here, which is in the comic book shop. It's not one of the base 6 cards, so it actually acts on its own. It's a vintage comic. There's only one of them, and it's worth 4 victory points if it's in your collection, and it won't be scored the same way that the sets will. So this is the first pile. I'm going to decide to keep it. Once you decide to keep a pile, you simply add it to your collection. If you have more than one issue in a set, you'll put them together and you'll start building towards a complete set. So Kids with Powers here, you'll see has 5 total issues in it. And here I am with 1. I also have an issue of Malware, which is the hot comic, and this is my collection. Once you have chosen a pile, you will replenish it by adding 2 comics back to the stack. So there will always be 3 piles here until you get towards the end of the game when some of these start running out. Now the game's gonna go until this entire draw pile and all 3 of these subsequent piles are empty. As soon as all of the cards are gone, play will continue until you get back to the first player, in which the game is over immediately and scoring will commence. Okay, so I have gone through my piles, I have managed my collection. The turn will now pass to my opponent. I'll be playing both sides of this game just for demonstration purposes. So again, we can't trade, we don't have anything in our collection, so I'll begin by looking at the first pile. Now, as you look through these piles in the real game, you will be hiding them from your opponents and making sure they don't see them, so it's knowledge only you will have, but for the sakes of demonstrating with you, I am laying them out. Okay, so they have a issue 2 of Grimm, and they have a Malware anthology. Now, the way anthologies work, you'll see there's a question mark for the issue number. They can count as any issue in the entire set. It doesn't matter which one, so for the sake of completing sets, you can count it as anything from issue 1 through issue 5 in Malware's case. Now, even though this is a good pile, for demonstration, I'll decide that they do not want it. So if you don't want a pile, you'll place it back face down. You'll take the top card from the main draw pile and add it on top. So now the next player, when they look at it, they'll have 3 cards. Now you'll continue on looking at the next pile in subsequent order all the way down. This one here, we have a Super Ikadakimasu issue 1 and a free comic card. So this isn't a standard issue. Instead, what it does is when you draw it, you can discard it to take any card in the comic book shop that you like. Now, they're gonna decide to keep this one, but if they continue to pass, you keep adding a card all the way down to the last pile. If you pass on this one as well, you'll simply take the top 2 cards from the stack and add them to your collection. Now, they're gonna add these to their collection, so they get issue 1 here, and they're gonna discard this free comic book card to take anything in the comic book shop they wish. So they'll take this issue of Stellar for the 4 bonus victory points that it gives. Then they'll replenish the pile that they just chose, and the turn will pass back over to here. Now, this is the first time that we can trade. We now are on the second turn and we have cards in our collection. So I'll explain how trading works. There are 2 places that you can trade comics. You can trade with the comic book shop, or you can trade directly with other players in the game. We'll start by explaining the comic book shop. Every trade you do with the comic book shop is gonna be 2 for 1. And by that I mean, if you're trading for 2 cards of a lower rarity, so for instance, I have this rare Kids with Powers. If I wanted to trade this to the market, I could get 2 cards, uncommon or common, from the comic book shop. So I could trade my rare Kids with Powers and I could get both of these uncommon Grimmin Kids with Powers if I wanted. The other way it works is if you are trading for an equal or higher rarity. So let's say that I wanted this rare Grimm Anthology. I can't just simply trade my rare card for that rare card. It'll never be 1-to-1 with the comic book shop. It's just not how it works. But I could trade 2 cards for any card essentially that I would want. So if I traded both my Kids with Powers issue 1 and my Malware issue 2, I could then get the Grimm Anthology from the comic book shop. And any cards you trade with the comic book shop will simply get added to it and be available to the other players on their turn. So that's how the comic book shop works. I said you can also trade with other players. So how that works, you can trade for any of their loose comics. Now, by loose comic, we mean that one that is not already in a set. So for instance, if I had this Kids with Powers issue 2 in my collection, I would put it on top of my issue 1, so now I'm starting to collect a set of Kids with Powers. Duplicate issues won't get added in, they will be their own separate set. But for the sake of the game and for the sake of scoring, you will start to stack them on top of each other, all the way up to the maximum allotted amount in that set. So Kids with Powers has 5 unique issues. If this were the case, the player over here, if during their trade they wanted to trade with me, Malware issue number 2 is my only loose comic. These 2 are locked, and so they cannot have access to them. The reason that is important is because if you decide to trade with another player, so for instance, if I wanted to trade my Kids with Powers issue 1 to them for their Stellar, you simply just get to trade the card and keep it. Now, you can't just trade for anything you want, of course. It does need to be of equal or greater value. So because the Stellar was a rare and because my Kids with Powers was also a rare, that trade is allowed. So we'll say that that was what I chose to do for my 1 trade in the turn. You can't trade with the shop and a player. You must choose one or the other, and you can only do 1 before you move on to pick piles. And you will always again start with the leftmost pile. Now, looking at this, we have an issue 1 Breakfast Club, an issue 2 Grimm, and a Malware Anthology. So I'm going to choose to keep this because Malware is our hot comic, so why not get more Malwares? Again,